Okay, so our last symposium was on the somewhat self-interested topic of how we can get AI to do what we want. Now we're going to switch to the point of view of the AI itself and ask about the moral status of AI, and with questions of the sort of what the rights of AI are, how the moral status depends on cognitive abilities. Our first speaker is Matthew Lau. He's the Arthur Zitrin Professor of Bioethics at NYU, the director of the Center for Bioethics, the editor of the Journal of Moral Philosophy, and the founder of the Ethics, Etc. group blog. He's interested in a broad spectrum of philosophical issues centering on ethics, bioethics, and moral psychology, and his title is going to be Artificial Intelligence and Moral Status.
Thank you, Ned. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Okay, so a couple years ago when I shared an office, well, not shared an office, when I had my office next door to Nick Bostrom, we actually tried to write a paper on this topic on artificial intelligence and moral status, but we never got around to finishing it. So I'm really glad to have this opportunity to think more about this topic. So machines and artificial intelligence are acquiring more and more capacities. We have Deep Blue winning. Speak into the mic. Okay. We have Deep Blue winning the chess, winning in chess. Watson winning in Jeopardy and AlphaGo. They're also, some of them are acquiring mobility. They can move around. We have the Google self-driving cars. And efforts are underway to build machines that can recognize emotions, so the so-called affective intelligence. And the possibilities that AIs may acquire human level or even greater than human level intelligence is being seriously considered, indeed by many people in this room. As AIs gain more and more capacities, the issue of whether they will acquire greater moral status becomes salient. Moral status is the standing that an entity has that gives moral agents a potential reason to act towards it in a certain way. So for example, cats have a certain status in virtue of being sentient. Their moral status qua sentience gives moral agents at least a potential reason not to, a potential reason to act towards them in a certain way. So for example, not to cause them unnecessary pain. So what kind of moral status will AIs have as they gain greater and greater capacities? Will they one day have human level moral status? Will they have greater than human level moral status? To answer these questions, we need a theory of moral status. So I'm going to begin by sketching such a theory. So to start, here's a list of entities that could have or could have moral status. And it's not intended to be exhaustive. So we have inanimate objects, rocks, the environment, non-human terrestrial living things, plants, animals, bacteria, et cetera, normal functioning human beings with full physical, cognitive, emotional, and social capacities, so normal adult human beings, damaged human beings, the comatose, the severely mentally disabled, human beings at the beginning of life, so fetuses, infants, possible future human beings, future generations, non-living human beings, dead human beings, and we could also talk about aliens, you know, if they exist, and we're going to apply this to AI and robots. So how do we determine what kind of moral status each of these entities has? So here are some constraints. First, it seems that we need some kind of objective empirical method. And the reason is that there doesn't seem to be an a priori way of knowing what kind of moral status an entity has. So for example, if we were to meet some alien beings when we go to Mars, and we want to know what kind of moral status it has, it seems that we would not be able to know this a priori. To find out, it seems that we would at least have to investigate empirically what attribute it has and consider whether these attributes are normally salient, such that the alien should have a certain kind of moral status. A second constraint is something called the species neutrality requirement. So the idea here is that the criterion for moral status should not exclude any species in advance. An example of a criterion that would exclude other species in advance is being human. Being human would exclude all other human species. So being human doesn't satisfy the species neutrality criterion. A third constraint is that the empirical criterion should be based on the intrinsic properties of an entity. So this is kind of controversial, but most people think that it's based on the intrinsic properties of an entity. So the intrinsic properties of an entity are properties that are internal or inherent to an entity. The extrinsic properties of an entity are properties that depend on an entity's relationship with other entities. So for example, being a moral agent is an intrinsic property that a normal functioning adult human being typically would have. Whereas being a spouse would be an extrinsic property that depends on someone's being married to another person. So suppose that you and your spouse are both drowning. You would, of course, value your spouse more based on your relationship with her and try to save her first. But in one respect, your spouse and the stranger would still have the same moral status in virtue of the fact that they're both moral agents. Okay. So here's some criterion for moral status. Whether an entity is alive, whether an entity is conscious, whether it's sentient, whether it can feel pain, whether it can desire, whether it has the capacity to know something about the causality, such as if one does X, then Y would happen, and the capacity to bring about something intentionally, so rational capacity, and whether it has the capacity to understand and act in light of moral reasons, so moral agency. So next, it seems that some entities are going to have greater moral status than others. So for example, if you compare a rock with a plant, it seems that the plant would have greater moral status. And an obvious explanation is that the plant is alive, but the rock isn't. And among entities that are alive, arguably some will have greater moral status than others. So if you compare a plant and a turtle, it seems that the turtle would have greater moral status than the plant. And an explanation of that is that the turtle is sentient and the plant isn't. And finally, among entities that are sentient, arguably some will have even greater moral status than others. So take a normal functioning adult human being and an adult. It seems that the human being would have greater moral status than the turtle. And the explanation here is something like the human being has moral agency while the turtle doesn't. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So let me say something about the basis of human moral status. The kind of moral status that human beings have is often called right-holding. They're called right-holders. So the question we want to ask is, are all human beings right-holders? So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. But it turns out that it's actually quite difficult to defend this claim. Philosophers who have examined it have tended to find themselves either agreeing that not all human beings are right-holders, or adopting what Peter Singer calls a speciesist position, where speciesism is defined as morally favoring a particular species, in this case human beings, over others without sufficient justification. So why is this? Well, the problem is that there doesn't seem to be a relevant empirical attribute that would apply to all human beings. So take actual sentience, for example. Some human beings, such as an encephalic infant or a comatose person, lacks actual sentience. Or take actual moral agency. Many human beings, including newborn infants, lack actual moral agency. These human beings will not be right-holders on these accounts of right-holding. And this is called the problem of marginal cases. So elsewhere, I've actually argued that we can have an account that doesn't have to be speciesist, And that appears to allow all human beings to be right holders. And what this account says is that a sufficient condition for an entity to be a right holder is if the entity has the genetic, or more generally, the physical basis for moral agency. Let me just very briefly sketch this account. So the physical basis for moral agency is the set of physical codes that generate moral agency. In human beings, this set of physical codes is located in their genome. And we know this because a lot of complexity is needed as the developmental basis for a complex adaptive phenotype like moral agency, and the genome contains a significant portion of this complexity. So to have the genetic basis for moral agency, the genes that make up moral agency must be activated and be coordinating with each other in an appropriate way. A being does not have the genetic basis for a certain attribute if it just possesses somewhere in its genome the genes for that, that could make up the attribute, but these genes are either not activated or are scrambled in such a way that they do not coordinate with each other appropriately. Let me just flesh that out. So suppose there's a book that contains many random words, which if put together would result in a Shakespeare book. This book would not be a Shakespeare book because it just contains the correct words. These words must be organized and be coordinated in the right kind of way. So I've argued that it can actually be shown that all human beings, including infants, the severely disabled, those in persistent vegetative state, and so on, have the genetic basis for moral agency. So given this, on my account, they would all be right holders. And this account avoids speciesism because if it turns out that gorillas and chimpanzees and other animals have the genetic basis for moral agency, or more generally, the physical basis for moral agency, they would also be right holders. And let me just add that this account is compatible with permissive views about abortion. So we can follow Judith Jarvis Thompson and say that even if a fetus is a right holder, a woman still has a right to determine what happens inside her body. That is, she has a right to bodily integrity. Okay. Let me just mention one other feature of this, this account. So there's this idea of the function of right holding, which says that if and when the right holder's interest is in conflict with the same kind of interest, that is, with the comparable interest of a non-right holder, the right holder's interest should prevail. So just to take an example, suppose that you have a choice between saving a turtle's limb and a human being's limb. The turtle's interest in keeping the limb and the human being's interest in keeping the limb appear to be comparable. The function of right holding says that you should save the human being's limb, which seems to be the correct verdict. Okay. So let us now consider what kind of moral status AIs can have. Is the AI alive? Is the AI conscious? Is the AI sentient? Can the AI feel pain? Can the AI desire? Does the AI have rational agency? Does the AI have moral agency? If an AI can acquire some or all of these capacities, it will gain the kind of moral status that accompanies each of these intrinsic properties. And I just realized that I printed my notes ran out. So I'm gonna have to freelance. So ran out of paper on my printer. Technology. Okay. So okay. So yes.
Could you hold the mic in your hand?
Yes. Okay. I can do that very easily. Yeah. Okay. Yes. More paper clips. That's right. So. So the idea, I mean, one of the issues that we're interested in finding out is whether AIs can have human-level moral status. So I think that there's a way for AIs to have human moral level status, and that is it's sufficient if an AI has the physical basis for moral agency. So that sort of comes out of my account of right holding. And again, that physical basis has to be active and be coordinating in the right way. So it's not enough that these physical codes are just sort of randomly strewn somewhere. It has to be activated and in the right kind of way. So then there's a further issue, which is whether AIs can have greater than human level moral status. And I think the answer to that question is sort of possibly. But I want to argue that if that's true, it's not going to be based on extending the current criteria that we have for moral status, such as rationality or moral agency. So let me explain why. So take here two people. So take rational agency, for example. So first, you got two people, right? You have a bright who's above average intelligence, say 150 IQ. Then you have average, average intelligence, say 100 IQ. It seems that even though bright is a lot brighter than average, we would say that they have equal moral status. They're both right holders. So if there's, say they're both are drowning, it seems that we would, maybe we should toss a coin. We wouldn't think that we necessarily have to save above average, right? And we wouldn't think that we would be doing something morally impermissible if we were to save average. Okay. Now, suppose you got somebody who's exceptionally bright. So this person has exceptional intelligence, 350 IQ. And then we still have the average here. Again, it seems that we wouldn't necessarily think that we should save exceptionally bright. Okay. And if that's the case, then if an AI is also exceptionally bright, say has 350 IQ, it doesn't seem like we would say that just because it's really smart, it has greater moral status. So it's not going to be, they're going to have the same kind of moral status, even though they have different, they differ in their levels of intelligence. What about moral agency? A lot of people, one of my accounts says that there's something really important about moral agency. So you might think, well, how about if someone is really moral? What if we amplify moral agency, the capacity for moral agency? Again, I don't think that it's going to change whether these two people are right holders, so or have different moral status. So take here, Joe has average moral agency, and Teresa has exceptional moral agency. Again, we wouldn't think that Teresa, we should always save Teresa and not Joe, and we would think that it would be impermissible to save Joe if say they were both in some sort of emergency situation. And so you can do the same thing. You can imagine AIs that are have exceptional moral agency, and we wouldn't again say that. It seems like we would say the same thing, that they have equal moral status. So the upshot of that is that if AIs, these AIs are going to have greater than human moral status, it's going to, and I'm not saying that that's not possible, it's going to have to come from somewhere else, like some other attribute, some other normatively salient attribute. Okay, so let me just finally conclude by talking about how we can get to artificial moral intelligence. This is talking about the future. I have stuff to say about self-driving cars as well. But I'm just here just only focusing on the future artificial moral intelligence. I think there are two ways to get there, through gradual substitution and through coding. So a lot of people have talked about gradual substitution, so I'm going to be very brief. So basically the idea here is that an individual's brain is replaced by an inorganic substitute gradually. So imagine that your brain, and you gradually replace it neuron by neuron with sort of an inorganic substitute. Now, assuming that consciousness is maintained, and this is a big assumption, there's a huge question about whether, when you substitute the neurons, whether at some point the consciousness might just disappear. But just, so I'm, making this big assumption that consciousness is maintained, now there's a question, suppose that the resulting being survives, right? It seems that this would be an artificial moral, this would be an entity with artificial moral intelligence. So that's sort of one way by which we can get artificial moral intelligence. Here's another way of, but a lot of people are talking about coding artificial moral intelligence. And here I want to say, and they're talking about sort of, I think they're talking about, I think this is true whether it's top down or bottom up. right? They're talking about coding things, putting moral theories like consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics into these AIs. And I don't think that's going to work. I think that these principles and norms are too specific and too high level for us to try to code into AIs. Not the least because there are so many of them, and it seems like it's impossible to put in all the different rules, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to suggest a different alternative, and this is based on sort of some work in moral psychology on the universal moral grammar. So the idea here is that the mind may be equipped with a universal moral grammar that enables each of us in different cultures unconsciously and automatically to evaluate a limitless variety of actions and generate moral evaluations such as right and wrong. So this came from John Rawls and Mikhail, drawing on Chomsky's work. So the way the moral faculty works is that it has domain general cognitive mechanisms generating representations of actions based on variables such as agent, intention, belief, action, receiver, consequence, and moral evaluation. And then some cognitive mechanisms, for example, the moral faculty, then combine these representations to generate moral judgments such as impermissible, permissible, and obligatory. I just published a book called The Moral Brains that has a lot, discusses a lot of these topics, so in case you want to look at it. Okay, so the idea here is that maybe we can draw on the universal moral grammar to have some sort of artificial moral grammar. So what we need are codes that would represent various variables over there, and then combine these representations to generate moral judgments, okay? And one other thing is that I think that genuine artificial moral intelligence are going to need to understand why a certain action is the morally right or wrong action. That is, they're gonna, the way we tell whether we've succeeded is whether they can understand whether an action is right or wrong. It's not gonna be enough that they know a bunch of moral propositions. And so I think the holy grail of artificial moral intelligence is gonna be moral understanding. So just to wrap up, I think AIs can achieve human level moral status when they have the physical basis for moral agency. To have greater than human level moral status, AI needs to acquire some other normatively salient capacity besides rational agency and moral agency. And a genuine artificial moral intelligence will have the capacity for moral understanding. Thank you.
So with your presentation you just gave us, it seems like that you dwelt on a lot of different terminology that you've defined in the first half of your presentation, particularly moral agency. I was a little confused about one of the examples you gave us, and even though this is a very sensitive issue to a lot of people, I hope you can deal with the terminology in particular. According to your claims, an unborn child has the genetic or physical basis to have a moral agency because an unborn child has its own genetic code. How then do you rationalize abortion? Does a woman's right to bodily integrity supersede an unborn child's moral status?
Yeah, I think it does. So I think I cover that. So they have the right to bodily integrity. And elsewhere, I have a whole discussion about sort of a human right. So I think bodily integrity is a fundamental condition for pursuing the basic activities. And so, so they have a right to that. And that's why,
Hi, I'm Bruce Costa from Granite Forest Sangha, and I noticed you had stated somewhat axiomatically about the differentiation we would make if someone were drowning, and maybe I'm alone in the room, but I struggle with that as an axiom that we wouldn't say save Mother Teresa before the boy, or perhaps
Good.
allow Adolf Hitler to drown before the boy, right? So I wonder if you could just kind of speak a little more on that, and if you would like, say what you were going to say about automated cars.
I think I will talk about that because I'll take another talk. But I will say that, so Hitler or something like that, I mean, if someone does something morally wrong, there are sort of different theories about desserts, and that's sort of, you can sort of think that the claim is an other things being equal claim. So other things being equal, if you're talking about two strangers, seems like you should, you should flip a coin. And if one is just smarter, so if two patients go into the sort of emergency room, you wouldn't say, hey, let's see, this one is smarter, let's save this one first. Like that would, it seems like that would be totally wrong, right? And so, but there are disagreements about that. I mean, some, if you're a consequentialist, you might think, oh no, if we could tell, then we really should say the smarter person. I disagree with that, but I agree with you that there is an issue there. So.
Thanks, Matthew. That was great. I just wanted to ask you, you said at some point that you thought the method for figuring out moral status would have to be empirical. And the reason you gave is that you'd have to empirically figure out what attributes a particular organism or creature has.
Yeah.
But of course, there's the question what attributes they have, and then the question of what the moral relevance of those attributes is, given that they have those attributes.
Right.
And it seems to me that last bit has to be a priori, or at least I don't know if any
That's right.
a posteriori ways of doing that.
That's right.
Did you mean to include both?
Yeah, I meant to include both. I just sort of, so it partly has to be empirical. It's a partly empirical inquiry where you at least have to look at, what attributes they have. That's an empirical question.
But
you
the conditional, the conditional, if they have these attributes, then they have moral status. That's presumably a priori.
That's right. That's right. You need to have a normative premise, and that normative premise is a priori. Thank you, Paul, for clarifying that for me. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for the talk.
Yeah.
So if you're taking the analogy between language and morality, what roadblocks do you think we'll face trying to program in a universal moral grammar that would be analogous to programming in language?
I don't know. So I wish Stephen Wolfram was here. He can sort of answer that question. But I think that, is he? Oh, maybe he wants to answer it. So I'm relying on people like Stephen to solve that problem for me. But the basic, the general idea is that we need to operate at a much lower level. This whole level about value alignment, et cetera, maximization, seems like that's already, there's too many, it's too theory laden, there are too many things. Sort of the basic, they're sort of, before any of that, they're sort of, so this is not even a bottom-up approach, this is sort of pre-bottom-up approach, in a sense that this moral faculty is just sort of, it's the way we view the world and we see moral properties and moral values, things like harm, persons, et cetera, and then some sort of mechanism for being able to combine those different things and weight them, right? And so we need, seems like that's the way to go. And then it's a further issue how these artificial moral agents, how they're going to make decisions. Maybe they'll make better decisions than we will because they'll have more information. Maybe they'll make worse, et cetera. That's an open question, and I don't say anything about that. But just see, in terms of one of the things I do want to say is that for AI researchers in the room, it seems like that could be explored. That could be fruitfully explored. Thanks.
All right, so I was just thinking, because you put a lot of emphasis on like the material basis, and it seemed peculiar to me. I mean, like humans from a few hundred years ago clearly don't have the moral development that we have, even though they have practically the same DNA.
Yeah.
And you might have beings that have such bizarre forms, or you might have virtual entities, right, that like don't have DNA at all, or a way to assess but yet they might be extremely sophisticated.
Thank you. I agree. That's why the account more generally is the physical basis for moral agency, and that's why it can accommodate artificial intelligence. So it just so happens that all the living things that we know have the have genetic basis, genetic codes, but that might change in the future. And if that were to be the case, then these other entities could also have moral agency.
So,
Yeah.
thanks very much. I wonder if it might be useful to distinguish between something like moral standing and value. So, moral standing, you might say, gets you into the category of being a rights holder. And then you might say, no matter what your intelligence or other kind of value would be, that you should have rights just like all the other rights holders. But I don't know if we want to say that rights holders always have precedence. So even a deontologist is probably willing to say there are some times when sacrificing a small human interest, if it would indeed reduce the suffering of animals, let's say, in a very substantial way, that would be a morally good thing. And so even a deontologist isn't committed to the idea that we have only one notion in play here, standing, and that it's got to be graduated in the way you suggest. We might have it as a qualification for certain kinds of moral consideration, holding responsible, things like that. But we don't want that to, so to speak, be a bar against considering against human interests or against even human claims that would be based on some kind of freedom of movement or action, completely ignore the disvalue that we could cause to other species.
That sounds absolutely right. So that's why when I defined moral status, I talked about portental consideration. So it's one reason, sort of other things being equal. Right. So and then the other thing I say is that when I talk about the function of right holding, I said that it has to be comparable interests. So if it's like one tiny interest of yours, but really, you know, if your tea is going to get cold and then there's a cat who's, you know, being run over by a car, it seems like you should go save the cat, right? Because the interests are not comparable. So I totally agree there. So it doesn't have lexical priority. It doesn't sort of trump.
So there won't be a general principle that right holders have precedence.
It's a protanto when the interests are comparable. Just sort of there's a reason, a sort of prima facie reason. There's sort of a sort of I don't know. I'm just using it. Yeah, sort of. There's it's not an all things considered reason, right? So, yeah.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, you're arguing that whether an entity is a right holder can be understood by its potential as a moral agent, right? And so is the AI itself not a moral agent and therefore a right holder on equal footing with a living, otherwise what we understand to be a living being, and therefore also with the second point that you made about a person of average moral intelligence not being on equal footing with someone of exceptional moral intelligence. So you could have an AI of low moral intelligence that has an equal moral status to an exceptionally moral living human.
I'm not sure if I quite follow that, but I think that so what I wanted to say was that sorry, can you just
is the AI not a moral agent? And,
yes.
And
okay.
by your definition, then
no,
a
AIs
right
could,
holder on the same footing as a
Yeah.
human being.
Good. So the AIs could be moral agents if they have the physical basis for moral agency. So there's nothing that bars them from having moral agency. In terms of the degree, I think that I think that there's some sort of hierarchy of moral status. So I think that moral agency may be more. This is something that hasn't been developed, but I'm inclined to think that moral agency has value over rational agency. So I'm imagining there's you. And then there's a really smart paperclip making being, right? And which one should I save? It seems like I should save you rather than this super intelligent paperclip making being. And if that's the case, it seems like moral agency has some sort of value overriding rational agency. But that's controversial. So,
wait, can I ask one question? It's really quick.
The next speaker is Eric Schwitzkabel. He doesn't seem to have slides. Is that possible?
Well, we do. We do have slides.
Do slides. Okay.
Get them watched.
Oh,
And
yes.
Mara Garza.
And Mara Garza. Yeah,
Yes.
sorry. Eric is professor of philosophy at UC Riverside. But most philosophers will know him as the author of the most widely read, and I think by far the best philosophy of mind blog, The Splintered Mind, where many really extremely interesting topics have come up that have resulted in papers by Eric such as a paper on why people used to dream in black and white, but now seem to dream in Technicolor. His main interests are philosophy of psychology, philosophy of mind, moral psychology. And he's also interested in classical Chinese philosophy. Mara is a grad student in philosophy at Riverside, and her interests are in ethics, mind, and their intersections in moral psychology. And the title is The Rights of Artificial Intelligences.
Thank you. So hypothetically, we might someday create entities with human-grade artificial intelligence. And by human-grade artificial intelligence, which from now on we'll just refer to as AI for short, we mean AI that's both cognitively and emotionally similar to human beings. That is, AI who have both human-like theoretical and practical intelligence, as well as a human-like capacity for joy and suffering. So today we're going to present a positive argument that human-grade AI would deserve moral consideration similar to what we owe natural human beings, and perhaps even more moral consideration than we normally owe to human strangers. And we're going to suggest 3 imperatives for ethical AI design and discuss a puzzle case we find interesting. So here's our argument for AI rights, which we call the no relevant difference argument. Premise 1, if entity A deserves some particular degree of moral consideration and entity B does not deserve that same degree of moral consideration, there must be some relevant difference between the two entities that grounds this difference in moral status, right? And for premise 2, there are possible AIs who do not differ in any such relevant respects from human beings. So conclusion, therefore, there are possible AIs who deserve a degree of moral consideration similar to that of human beings. And the conclusion here is intentionally modest. We're only saying that there are possible AIs who deserve equal moral consideration. We're not committing to technological optimism about actually creating such AIs in the foreseeable future, nor do we commit to any particular architecture that they would take. And then if desired, if you want to, you can make the argument bolder. You can strengthen it in either dimension, the first or second premise. So premise 2 relies on what counts as possible AIs receiving equal moral consideration. So we might strengthen it by more narrowly specifying what types of entities would deserve moral consideration. For example, somebody who's an enthusiast about simulated realities might argue that there's possible AIs who live entirely in simulations and who nonetheless deserve equal moral consideration. And then premise 1 relies on there being a relevant difference, and you might make the argument bolder by narrowing what types of differences are relevant differences. For example, you might argue that material constitution is never relevant unless there's going to be some psychological or social difference that goes along with that material difference. And for example, the fact that some possible AIs are virtual may not count as a relevant difference from humans to diminish their moral status. So this no relevant difference argument suggests a kind of test of moral status, which we call a difference test. The difference test is a type of moral argumentative challenge. If you're going to regard one entity as deserving greater moral consideration than another, then you ought to be able to point to a relevant difference between these entities that justifies that differential treatment, and an inability to provide such justification opens you up to suspicions of chauvinism or bias. So there are possible objections to even the modest, unstrengthened version of our no relevant difference argument, and here are 3 objections to the second premise in our brief replies. So there's this objection from psychological difference. According to this objection, all possible AIs would be importantly psychologically different from natural human beings in a way that would prevent them from deserving equal moral status. For example, they might inevitably lack free will or consciousness or human-like creative insight. And our reply, well, the objection overestimates the difference between us and possible future AIs who might be designed along very different lines than current AIs. So future AI systems might involve artificially grown biological or semi-biological systems, chaotic systems, evolved systems, artificial brains, and so on. And even researchers such as John Searle and Roger Penrose, who are famously skeptical about conscious AI designed using architectures that are currently popular, even they allow that future very different architectures might generate artificial beings who have as much or as little free will, consciousness, and creativity as natural human beings have. So for the next objection, this objection from duplicability, so the objection might be something like AIs would be duplicable in a way that natural human beings aren't, so that destroying an AI is less of a tragedy than destroying a human being. And our reply to the objection is maybe duplicability does reduce this moral worth of something, but there are possible AIs so complex that they would be no more duplicable than a human being. Or it might also be someday possible to duplicate natural human beings, in which case that argument would lose its force. And then finally, in some cases, duplicability, you could think of it as increasing the moral worth of something. For example, if one entity is a planned template for making 10,000 more, then destroying that one might be more of a tragedy than destroying another entity that can't be duplicated. And then the objection from otherness. So according to this objection, since we're human beings, we owe a special duty to the human species. Thus, there'll always be a difference between us humans and them AI. And reply, reflection on hypothetical cases reveals this to be kind of obnoxious if intended as a general principle. So you can imagine that there was somebody psychologically similar to us in every way, blamelessly put into our society from infancy, and ignorant of its status as an AI, and maybe unknown to everyone around, including herself. This being had been artificially grown in a vat rather than from human DNA, and is so, because of that, not a member of our biological species, or maybe has an artificially constructed brain, but one that works just like ours, with the same kinds of thoughts and feelings and conscious experience. So it would be a cruel mistake to demote such a being from full moral considerability simply upon discovering this artificial nature or origin. And then here's a fourth objection, this objection from existential debt. So suppose you build a fully human-grade intelligent robot, fully conscious, fully capable of human levels of joy and suffering, full of long-term hopes for its future. And suppose now that this human-grade robot costs you $10 a month to maintain. You maintain it for a couple of years, but then after a while you decide you'd rather spend the $10 a month on a magazine subscription. So you decide to dismantle and delete the robot. Learning of your plan, however, the robot complains, "Hey, I'm just a being as worthy of continued existence as you are. You can't just kill me for the sake of a magazine subscription." And suppose you reply, "You ingrate, you owe your very life to me. You should be thankful just for the time I've given you. I owe you nothing if I choose to spend my money differently. It's my money to spend." So the core idea of this objection from existential debt is that artificial intelligence, because it's made by us, owes its existence to us, and thus it can be terminated or subjugated at our pleasure without moral wrongdoing, as long as its existence overall has been worthwhile. And now consider this possible argument in defense of eating humanely raised meat and see how it might be different. So a steer, let's suppose, leads a happy life grazing on lush hills. It wouldn't have existed at all if the rancher hadn't been planning to kill it for meat. Its death for meat appears to be a condition of its existence, so seen as a package deal, the rancher having brought it into existence and then killed it is overall morally acceptable. But then, or imagine a religious person dying of cancer who doesn't believe in an afterlife. She might console herself by thinking, overall, her life has been good. She's grateful, so God has given her nothing to resent. And so analogously, the argument might go, your robot's continuation at your pleasure was a condition of its very existence, why it came into existence. So it has nothing to resent. So we're not sure how this argument works for non-human animals raised for meat, but we reject this argument from this objection from existential debt for human-grade AI. We think the case is closer to this clearly morally odious case, which Eric will continue with.
All right, so suppose that Anna and VJ decide to get pregnant and have a child. The child lives happily for his first 8 years. On his 9th birthday, Anna and VJ decide they'd prefer not to pay any further expenses for the child so that they can have a boat instead. No one can easily be found to care for the child, so they kill him painlessly. But it's okay, they argue, just like the steer, just like the robot, they wouldn't have had the child, let's suppose, had they known they'd be on the hook for supporting it all the way up till its 18th birthday. The child's support at their pleasure was a condition of its very existence. Overall, its life has been worthwhile. It has nothing to resent. So we hope that you'll agree that their thinking isn't a good example of moral thinking. Their decision to have a child carries with it a responsibility for the child. It's not a decision to be made lightly and then undone, although in some sense the child owes its existence to Anna and VJ. That's not a callable debt that can be vacated by this, then discontinuing the child's existence. So our thought is that for an important range of possible AIs, the situation would be similar. Right? If we bring into existence genuinely conscious, human-grade artificial intelligence, fully capable of joy and suffering, with a full human range of theoretical and practical intelligence, with expectations of future life, then we make a moral decision approximately as significant and irrevocable as the decision to have a child. So we're inclined, in other words, to flip the objection from existential debt on its head. If we intentionally bring a human-grade AI into existence, we put ourselves into a social relationship that carries responsibility for the AI's welfare. We take upon ourselves the burden of supporting it, or at least sending it out into the world with a fair shot at a satisfactory existence. So, artificial beings, if they're psychologically similar to natural human beings in consciousness, creativity, emotionality, self-conception, morality, rationality, fragility, all that stuff, they warrant substantial moral consideration in virtue of that fact alone. If, furthermore, we are also responsible for their existence and their features, then they have a moral claim on us that otherwise similar human strangers would not have to the same degree. All right, so that's our primary argument for the moral status of AIs. Now we're going to suggest 3 imperatives of ethical AI design, and then we'll conclude with a puzzle case. All right, so the epistemology of consciousness is quite a tangle, especially the epistemology of the consciousness or not of hypothetical future AIs. Right? Suppose that you create a sophisticated machine that's capable of some sophisticated and intelligent seeming behavior. Is it conscious? Does it have a real stream of experience? Is it capable of genuine joy and suffering? On almost every view of morality, these facts about it would be morally relevant to its moral status. So, if it's hard to know what kind of conscious experience it would or would not have, then it would be hard to know what our moral obligations to that AI would be, right? So that kind of difficult epistemology then invites 3 related imperatives of AI design that we want to suggest. One is, if we are going to continue to make intelligent and sophisticated AIs, then we should simultaneously prioritize research into the nature of consciousness and the conditions under which we could reasonably expect that genuine joy and suffering would emerge from complex systems. Otherwise, we might accidentally create conscious beings without realizing that we're doing so. Or alternatively, we might think we've made conscious beings without actually having done so. And either possibility invites moral catastrophe. We should also consider a second principle, which we call the design policy of the excluded middle. According to this policy, we should only design artificial intelligences whose moral status is clear one way or another, right? We should either design AI that's simple enough that we know that it doesn't merit serious moral concern and can be deleted at will, or alternatively, we should create AI whose moral status we know deserves respect and then give it its due. Violating the excluded middle policy means creating AI whose moral status is unclear. This would then create an unfortunate dilemma, right? So the dilemma would be either you give this dubious AI full moral rights you think it might deserve, or you give it diminished rights. If you give it the full rights and it doesn't in fact have consciousness enough to merit, or sophistication enough to merit the level of moral concern that you give it, then you might be sacrificing real human interests for something that doesn't have interests worth that sacrifice. But on the flip side, if you give the AI diminished rights, when in fact it might really deserve full rights, then you risk perpetrating slavery and murder without realizing that you're doing so. Here's a third design policy. We call this the emotional alignment design policy. And the idea here is that you want to design artificial intelligence to provoke an appropriate range of emotional responses from ordinary users, neither too much nor too little. Now, just suppose the researchers eventually figure out tricky questions about what types of AI do and do not deserve serious moral consideration. We shouldn't create an AI that deserves serious moral consideration and then put it into a bland box with a poor user interface that tempts people to disregard its status. Conversely, we shouldn't create AI that generates a powerful impression in ordinary users of deserving serious moral consideration if that AI is not really sophisticated enough to deserve that moral consideration. So, for example, suppose you create an AI without consciousness, but which ordinary users react to as though it's really conscious, really deserves consideration, and now there's an accident in which both that AI and a normal natural human are both in mortal danger. Right? You wouldn't want an ordinary user to rush to save the beloved but unsophisticated, non-conscious AI and let the ordinary human die. Right? So our emotional responses to AI should be neither too high nor too low. Now, in Douglas Adams' novel, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, there's this scene in which this protagonist, Arthur Dent, is given a chance to meet the meat. He's an uplifted, intelligent steer, ambles up to him in a posh restaurant and starts talking about how delicious he is and what cuts of him would be the tenderest, right? And the idea is Arthur's going to pick out a slice of this steer, and then the steer's going to go in the back room and shoot himself for Arthur's dinner. Arthur, naturally enough, finds this prospect unappetizing. Or here's another example. Consider a human-grade android that's sent on a dangerous scientific mission alongside several natural humans. To be capable of astute scientific and practical reasoning and smooth social interaction, this AI is given a normal complement of human emotions, except for one difference. It radically deprioritizes the continuation of its own existence compared to the continuation of the other humans and the completion of the scientific mission. Without qualm or resentment, this AI would sacrifice itself if that meant a 5% increase in the likelihood of one human surviving, or if it meant that the data collected at the end of the mission would be higher quality. We might imagine both Arthur's meat and the scientific android are pre-designed to want nothing more than to commit suicide on our behalf if that's what it takes to meet their goals. Right? The steer desperately wants to kill itself to be someone's dinner. The scientific android desperately wants to kill itself to avoid a small risk to natural humans or the scientific mission. So we think two interesting ethical questions arise from this. One is it ethical to design genuinely conscious human-grade AIs in this way so that they want to commit suicide on our behalf? And the other is, if they are somehow created, should we attempt to prevent their suicide as we would normally attempt to prevent the suicide of a human being? So we're not sure how to answer those questions. We want to leave time for discussion. So we're just putting these out there as worth some thought. But we do want to conclude with one other thought, which is a possible fourth ethical design principle. We think that in the case of the steer, what makes us recoil, maybe, is that the steer doesn't seem to properly value its own life. There's something wrong, it seems, in its wanting to commit suicide simply to become someone else's dinner. It's not as clear to us that there's wrong with something similarly wrong with the scientific android case, but maybe so. And either way, we're thinking of maybe we should consider this fourth design principle, which we call the self-respect design principle. And that would be, if human-grade AIs are someday created, they should be created with an appropriate appreciation of their own value and moral status. Thank you.
Hi, Julian Tegelius, NYU. So looking at this, what you're saying here at the last slide, shouldn't the obvious ethical question be the opposite? Is it moral to create an android or create any AI that actually values its own existence? It would seem to be more moral to design something like a research android that can be happy and then successfully terminate when the mission is over. That would allow perfect happiness.
I mean, I guess it's just testing this intuition. Like, with a human being, you would say, no, you need to value your own existence. You don't want to destroy yourself. And then why, I don't know, why, you might say, okay, they don't have this desire to live, but they have it in their interest to live. So then why with the AI can't you say the same thing? Is it because they don't belong to a species where everybody, you think everybody should do that, or that seems to be the standard? It just seems difficult to say, like, why you would say it in one case with your fellow human, but not say it in the other case if they're essentially the same except for that difference. And it could be an artificially intelligent creature that's organic. I mean, it might just look like a human, have a brain very similar to a human, just be artificially built. So I don't know, like that intuition might then, if it seems that human-like, it might, might be more sympathetic to it.
So there are two reasons why we don't kill people generally, right? One is, we attempt for moral reasons to minimize human suffering. But the other one is also because there's another moral reason, which is that we kind of, increase the entropy of the universe if we delete a complex organism, basically. That all the information that, was created in the brain and the being of that person disappears when that person dies. It may not be the case for androids or robots or AI systems, in the sense that they may have multiple bodies with one mind that survives the death of a body. So in that case, the moral consequence of, perhaps they will still have suffering when one of their bodies dies, but the increased entropy is limited to their physical body, not to their mind, which will survive. And so the cost of the physical deletion, as opposed to the deletion of the entire mind, is considerably less. So it's a completely different situation as humans.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. So I would say if the AI continues as a mind when its body is destroyed and then can be re-embodied later, that wouldn't actually be killing the AI. Yeah, so that wouldn't then be a case of murder. That would be maybe an inconvenience or something, yeah.
Hi, loved your talk. So I'm wondering if there are cases where our intuitions will fail, but there are still moral imperatives. In particular, the carrying capacity of the universe for artificial minds is vast, almost beyond imagining. And someone could argue that there is a moral imperative to allow this process of expansion to unfold. In this process, we might be faced with different kinds of mind crime, where our intuitions would tell us that it's unacceptable, but the potential payoff might be worth it overall. This seems like a very thorny issue, and I was wondering what your thoughts were. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that our moral intuitions were built up out of materials in our evolutionary history and our social cultural history and our developmental history. And they're tuned to a certain limited range of circumstances in which most of the beings who we interact with who are similar to us in one dimension of complexity are also similar to us in other dimensions of complexity. There's certain maxima to the possibility of joy and the rationality of the beings around us, right? So there's a very limited range of environments in which our moral intuitions were cultivated. Once we break out of those environments, it's natural to suspect that our moral intuitions will start to break down. But the problem is, in my view, we don't have a good epistemology for figuring out what the moral truth is once our intuitions start to break down, right? So this puts us in a difficult position to see through those issues.
Yeah, question here. To paraphrase Jeremy Bentham, I think he said, it doesn't matter whether or not it has qualia, but whether or not it can suffer. And another famous person said, no brain, no pain, which I agree with. But I don't think it works in the reverse, no pain, no brain. I mean, you can have, pain without, you can have a brain without pain. How much weight would you put on the ability to suffer, the capacity for suffering, as opposed to just consciousness or internal experience? And if so, why not design a machine that doesn't have a somatosensory cortex or a limbic system?
So in this paper and in general, we're trying to be pretty broad about what the basis for moral patency or moral considerability would be. So we're kind of just trying to load everything in, right? Consciousness and suffering and rationality and all that kind of stuff, and say, let's assume that you've got all that stuff. Now, if you then say, okay, well, which is the really important stuff in there? That's a question that I don't think Amara and I are prepared to answer right now. That's not part of our project at this moment.
Oh, hi, thank you for that talk. My name's Tracy Lau, and
I don't.
Sorry, I'm over here. And yeah, I wanted to. I noticed you were asking about consciousness and about that's one of the prerequisites for moral consideration. And I know Christoph Koch, who's one of the world's experts in consciousness, that believes it's a continuum, and so animals do have consciousness to varying degrees. Given that as a human species we've completely failed in terms of coming up with solutions like cultured meat. I know that the funding for that is very poor right now. We haven't developed technologies to prevent us inflicting a lot of suffering on billions of animals. Given this, well, in my opinion, a massive failure, what are your fears about how, and I think the work you're doing is incredibly important, but the fear that they're not going to be protected because they may not be in a position of power, and if we look on how animals are treated, it's, well, I think it's a failure. And are we just going to bring that forward into our treatment of AIs?
Why don't you want to take this one, Mara?
Well, I mean, I guess that's what like a paper like this would try to set out maybe is anticipation. Like instead of having some crisis where you enslave a bunch of robots, or you have a bunch of androids and they slowly, maybe after several versions, finally get to a state where they would have as much status as an animal, let's say. I guess you'd want to be prepared for that. Because I think human-grade AI is interesting, but also it could be like the case that you would want to give them as much as animal rights like earlier on or something like that. So it's good to anticipate that, definitely.
Yeah, and I think, and I would also affirm your point about the power relationship. So currently, the power relationship is that we're the designers and so we're the bosses, and the legal framework is their property and stuff like that, right? So if you just kind of assume that as the kind of social starting point, then it seems like it would be natural that if AI were created, it would be in some sort of subservient position, which might be problematic.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop this session. So you're Ronald Sandler? Okay, hi. Okay, you're going to start? Okay, so our next speakers are Ronald Sandler and John Bassel. They're going to share the podium here. I hope we're going to get into the issue of, oops, sorry, pardon me.
My time's up already?
Yeah, we're moving faster and faster. I hope they're going to get into the issue of how capacities are relevant to moral agency, but we'll see. Ron is Associate Professor of Philosophy and the Director of the Ethics Institute at Northeastern. His research areas are environmental ethics and the intersections of ethics and technology. And John, who will be part of this, is an Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Northeastern, whose work focuses on ethics, applied ethics, and the philosophy of biology.
Thank you. So as the title indicates, what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be trying to motivate the idea or propose the idea that responsible development of robust AI would be promoted by implementing some AI research oversight committees, similar to the types of committees that are used in other types of research, like human subjects research or embryonic stem cell research. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how that might be structured, how the committees might be tasked, how they might be constituted, empowered, and so on. Now, my job was to motivate this project, and then John is going to talk about the details of what the committees might be like. But in a lot of ways, the last two talks were just motivating the project. So thanks, Matt, Eric, and Mara. I appreciate that. Because the one thing to recognize is if we think that that artificial intelligences that have capacities similar to humans are going to have the same moral status similar to humans, they're going to come from somewhere. There's going to be a process by which they come about. And so, and there's going to be some features of that process that's going to make it, that's going to require some sensitivity to what's going on. So for example, as Eric pointed out, there's going to be epistemological issues. It's not going to be always obvious that these capacities are emerging at a certain rate. Another concern is, or to take Eric's point and Mara's point, look, if you have design principles that you could put into them if they are going to be morally considerable, such that you want to make sure that when they do arise, people are going to be able to recognize them, then you have to have some kind of enforcement mechanism to make sure that those design principles are followed. So we heard earlier today that one thing we could do is we could trust the AI researchers wherever they're working on it that they're going to be benevolent, they're going to design these things in, and they're going to take precautions. But there's lots of research, there's lots of research that involves possibly emergent moral status properties. Embryonic stem cells research is like this, and chimeric research where you're mixing genomic materials between humans and non-humans in the research. And in these kinds of cases, we do think that there has to be some kind of oversight mechanism, some kind of review process to make sure that, if issues arise, then they're recognized, and to make sure that, and this is to a question that came up earlier, that maybe there's certain kinds of experiments that might actually not be okay because the experiments themselves or the outcomes could be disrespectful of the moral status of the agents, so of the research subjects. So if if we think that it's possible that we're going to have entities that during the course of research are going to have capacities that are going to give them moral status, and that those capacities are going to merge throughout this process, they need to be recognized, then we're going to probably need some kind of institutional oversight mechanism to make sure that the research is sensitive to this and that researchers design in the appropriate protocols and mechanisms of recognizing when this occurs. Okay? So then the question just becomes, how do you do this? And in the other cases, we've seen that, that a committee mechanism is the best way to do it. And so that's the approach that John and I were thinking about for this, and he's going to come up and talk about the details about how that might work.
I was told not to tap the mic. Can everyone hear? So thanks, Ron. So if we assume that in the development of artificial intelligence, sometimes they'll have capacities which ground moral status, and so therefore we owe them consideration. The question then, like Ron said, is how do we make sure that they're treated in a way that's appropriate, given that they have those capacities and have moral status? So, what sort of oversight model should we use to ensure their protection? So research subject oversight, when it comes to, so there are different kinds of oversight. We might care about oversight to protect us from AI, but when it comes to subject-sensitive oversight, oversight that's designed to protect research subjects, we typically use what we call a committee-based model. You have a group of people with the relevant kinds of expertise. They're typically submitted some form of a protocol that describes the research that's going to be done. They have a set of questions they ask about that, and then via some mechanism they approve or disapprove the protocol. They have various different powers. Common versions of this are IRBs, institutional review boards. Anybody who's had to deal with those, they're the bane of your existence. I'm sorry. And the same is true for people who do animal research. We have what called our IACUCs, Animal Care and Use Committees. So this is a standard model, and there are reasons that it's the standard model, and there are good reasons why it would be a good model in the case of artificial intelligence research. There's a certain set of advantages it has with the alternative. The alternative kind of model would be what we might call a compliance model. You have a set of rules, you have compliance officers, they make sure the researchers are following the rules. But this is actually not a really good model for AI research for several reasons. One is tied up with different forms of epistemic uncertainty when it comes to which capacities these things are going to have and how they're likely to develop. I'm going to get into those a little later. But also because there are just many different forms that AI research takes. You might have, there's the machine learning group, and there might be the brain simulation group. And so you might think that it's hard to design a single set of rules that's going to be useful in governing all these different modes of research. And also the technology advances rapidly. So you have this worry about lag, that if you set a set of rules, researchers are going to be slowed down by having to comply with them and having to get them changed when it's time to sort of consider new ways of building AI. So the committee-based model is more nimble, it's more adaptable, it's less likely to slow down research, while still being responsible to the ethical challenges raised by giving rise to morally salient capacities. So how do we develop and structure robust AI research subjects oversight committees? And that's what I really want to focus on. Here's sort of a schema for developing oversight committees. So for subject-sensitive oversight. So you identify some ethical aims. These are the important things we want a committee to accomplish. Then you identify a set of obstacles, things that are going to prevent us from achieving those ethical aims, and then you constitute, task, and empower a committee to resolve those issues. So you say, here are the experts we need to resolve these obstacles. Here's the kinds of tasks we should assign them. We should got to design protocols to figure out what kind of information we need to give them, figure out what kinds of questions they should ask, and then give them a bunch of power. Maybe not too much power. You have to negotiate these powers to balance protecting research subjects when it's appropriate and not slowing down research too much. And so I want to model this, show you how this sort of schema works in a particular case. So I'm going to talk you through how we can apply this schema to an existing case of animal welfare regulation. So all federally funded animal research in the United States is governed by the Animal Welfare Act. And the way that is implemented is through these things called IACUCs, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. And here's how sort of the IACUCs fit into the schema. So what is the ethical aim? So the ethical aim as laid out by the law is that we have an obligation to minimize the suffering of vertebrate research subjects consistent with realizing legitimate research aims. So it's not that we can't cause animals to suffer, although maybe you think that's morally appropriate. That's not how our legal framework has it set up. The law requires that we minimize animal suffering consistent with achieving legitimate research aims. So that's the ethical aim. obstacles. There are some challenges related to questions of how will this protocol, this proposed design, cause suffering? What are the ways this animal can suffer? How are they likely to suffer given the way things are set up? And this raises challenge that you need to answer by appealing to someone who can tell you what kinds of research subjects and suffer in which ways. There are things like, so for example, different rodents suffer differently from different kinds of captivity. So I think that rats mind or are stressed by not being in group housing in ways that mice are not. I might have it backwards. And so you need to answer questions like that. Which of these research subjects is likely to suffer less? You need to answer questions about scientific legitimacy. So not only are the animals going to suffer, but is this research worth causing animal suffering to achieve whatever the ends are? That question is extremely hard to answer. Whenever I assign my students a sample research protocol, they almost never think the research is worth doing. You need an actual scientist to tell you why this little thing, why these 50 mice suffering, to answer this. In my case, it was always pigeons. I was on an IACUC for a while. There was always a researcher that wanted to know how pigeons located targets on the ground. And the first question you ask is, well, does this help us in any way? Is the pigeon brain anything like ours such that this would help us? And the answer is no. But then the scientist would say, yeah, but here's how it contributes to this broader research project and explain to me why I should be okay with this, and then point me to the fact that the NSF thought it was good enough. So I should think it's good enough too. So we have to be able to answer these research legitimacy questions and put this research in broader context. And another set of challenges involves biases. And I'm not saying that scientists are just going to pass anything through the IACUC. In my experience, scientists are very responsible members of IACUCs. But of course, they have a bias towards minimizing the suffer of animals. Lots hangs on getting research done. Lots of money is in the balance. You can have worries about quid pro quo schemes, about one scientist approving this because they might be a member on the IACUC, or they might be submitting a protocol next time when the IACUC has a different member, things like that. So how do you address these obstacles to achieve the ethical aim of minimizing suffering? Well, the way IACUCs are composed is they have at least 3 members covering these 4 categories: a veterinarian, a scientist, a non-scientist, and a non-institutional member, someone that's not from the institution doing the research. Usually IACUCs are much bigger. They don't just have 3 members. There's not someone playing a dual role. Some institutions, University of Wisconsin, for example, has each college that does animal research has its own IACUC, and there's a campus-wide IACUC, and they have 15 to 20 people. But you can see why that constitution will help you achieve overcoming those obstacles. You have someone the veterinarian that can answer questions about how various members of different species suffer and under what context they'll suffer. You have scientists that can tell you about the worth of scientific research, and you have members of the public and people outside of the discipline to protect against bias towards or bias against animal welfare. So they're tasked with. They're given a set of protocols. They have this expertise. They're tasked with assessing the protocol to make sure it achieves the ethical aim, helping each other to answer these questions from drawing on their different areas of expertise. And then they have the authority to approve the protocol or not. If not, it goes back to the researcher. They try again. Monitoring life during the life of the protocol, the veterinarian will typically walk around the animal facilities, and they have the power to suspend the protocol. So there's some serious power to make sure that we're achieving the ethical aim. So now when we transition to the question of AI research subjects oversight, the question is, how can we sort of take this schema and apply it and try to develop AI research oversight to protect research subjects? So let's just start with the ethical aims. It'd be nice, it'd be really great if we could just draw on the ethical aims of IACUCs and say, hey, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to minimize suffering consistent with achieving legitimate research aims. But there's a problem with that. We are not sure exactly what kinds of capacities AI research subjects are going to have. And if they have robust capacities like us, we heard from Matthew, and I think this is consistent with what Eric and Mara were saying, we're going to owe them more. It's not appropriate to treat human research subjects in a way that minimizes their suffering consistent with achieving legitimate research aims. IRB protections are much stronger than IACUC protections. So we need something that's a little broader that's going to be protective of the many different kinds of individuals we could have given their different levels, I don't want to say levels, different types of moral status they might have. So here's one stab. Oh, this doesn't work. There we go. Here's one stab at I think a plausible stab at what the ethical aims could be that would cover the variety of cases. Treat each AI in a way that's commensurate with its moral status. If the AI has cognitive capacities that are very similar to the cognitive capacities of dogs, we should treat it the way that it would be appropriate to treat a dog. Now, we might just adopt the IACUC standard and say what that means is minimizing the suffering of that animal consistent with research aims, or we might rethink what's commensurate treatment given the type of being it is. If the AI ends up having human-like capacities, then we should apply a different standard. And because we may develop things that have totally alien capacities to us, we're going to have to think about what beings of that type that have this cluster of relevant, morally salient capacities, what types of treatment are commensurate with that type of moral status or given those capacities. So that's, I think, the moral aim. Now the hard part. Areas of difficulty. I've divided the areas of difficulty into 3 distinct parts. I'm not naive enough to think that I've covered them all. I'm not naive enough to think that these categories have hard borders. But they're sort of useful ways of thinking about these. So consciousness challenges. So one problem that appears here that appears, I think, less so in animal ethics research is the question about the bases of consciousness. Paul Boghossian likes to bring this up every 3rd or 4th talk, and I've been really thankful for that. We really don't have a good answer to this question. But that doesn't matter so much in the case of animals because they have behaviors and physiology, and they're tied to us via evolutionary history, so that we know that those behaviors and physiology are pretty good evidence that they have capacities like ours. If they have a similar brain part, this is very naive science. If they have brains that are very similar to ours and they behave in ways that are similar to ours, we can expect that they evolve for similar purposes and so have similar qualia. You might be skeptical of that, but our inferences about minds that are like ours and evolutionarily related to ours are better than our inferences about minds that are made of computer parts that don't share an evolutionary history and aren't physiologically like ours. At least that you can try to talk me out of that. So that makes it important to figure out, like, what is the basis of consciousness, because that would actually help us determine what capacities these things have. If you're a naive behaviorist, this becomes very easy, but also very ethically challenging. You can figure out, oh, this thing is satisfying these naive behavioral rules, so therefore it's conscious, right? So we can answer, does it have these capacities by applying a behavioral test? If you have a different view about the bases of consciousness, you have to figure out whether it has those bases. But it might be one of the most tractable ways to answer which capacities does this AI have, is answering this question. So that's important, but we also have a set of empirical questions related to this. We might ask, given that there's different mechanisms for developing artificial intelligence, given different technologies, how likely are we to realize those bases of consciousness? So if you're using, let's say, I don't know, direct brain simulation, you might be, hey, if this works, we're pretty sure it's going to have these bases of consciousness, so that tells us something about its morally relevant capacities. If you use an evolutionary algorithm, you may have no idea whether it satisfies the bases of consciousness. So you want to know, what's the probability of achieving various bases of consciousness given different kinds of ways of developing AI? So those are some challenges having to do with consciousness. Epistemological challenges, some of these are also related to consciousness, but we might be completely in the dark about the capacities of developed AI. Might be completely in the dark. So then let's say you do some research, you develop an AI, and you want to try to figure out whether it has moral status. We need a set of ways to test hypotheses about, for example, alien intelligences. How do we come to make these inferences? What kind of behavior should we look for? What kind of responses should we look for? So you need that. And then there's a set of normative questions. One of those normative questions is, what is the commensurate treatment given these kinds of capacities? Like, given that this individual has these capacities, what's the appropriate way to treat it? So that's a straightforward normative question that some moral philosophers will claim to have settled. I often claim to have settled some of them. But we're going to have to fight about that in the context of designing AI research oversight. But there's other normative questions, like given that we're not going to answer the consciousness questions or the epistemological questions in a compelling way for everyone, how should we reason under disagreement and uncertainty? So the Future of Humanity Institute has a project where how do you reason under cases where you have serious chance of risk and high degrees of uncertainty? And you might think, well, you could be morally cautious. You don't want to harm any moral agents. And then maybe you go the way that Eric and Mara did. You just don't do research unless you can be really sure that you're going to be able to tell whether it's conscious. That will significantly slow down research, I suspect, so you might try to use some other normative principle for how to make decisions in uncertainty. Okay, so how do you address those obstacles? I just want to talk a bit about constituting the committee, and then I'll be done. We need experts from a wide variety of fields. So to address the consciousness problems, we need to talk to philosophers of mind, cognitive and neuroscience. I didn't put psychologists here, but they should totally be up here. But we're also going to need computer scientists and engineers. They're going to be the ones. So let's say the neuroscientists tell us, hey, if you get a system that's functionally like this, it's conscious. We're going to need computer scientists and engineers to tell us whether that's been physically realized in another system, right? Maybe the neuroscientists won't know. To answer the epistemological questions, we're going to need philosophers of science, epistemologists, but also I think we should draw on ethology and biology, people who are equipped to try to go out and find a new species and try to guess what its cognitive, they don't guess, try to determine what its cognitive capacities are. So we want to draw on them because they're good at designing these kinds of inferences. And then for the normative questions, we're going to need ethicists, decision theorists. So it's a broad range of expertise. And that itself, I think, raises some serious challenges. First of all, there are just obstacles to interdisciplinarity that Wendell Wallach was talking about before. We talk a lot about wanting to be interdisciplinary, but we're not. But a more serious problem is that there are not that many places in the world that have that kind of diversity of expertise. And so you could worry about this concentration of research, or like if you put these rules in place that you have to be committee approved to do this research, you could worry about a concentration of intellectual resources and certain people being excluded from engaging in these research projects. So to address that, you have to consider things that we don't do with other committees, which is decentralized and distributed committees. Maybe the right model is to have, there's a place where these committees are formed and they draw on expertise from lots of different institutions, and then institutions themselves send their protocols to these committees and get feedback from them, instead of having it the way it is now with typical committees, which is every institution has their own. And there are some remaining challenges. First of all, funding. There are going to be administrative costs to this. There are going to be costs to continuing to think about what should be in a research protocol. There are going to be challenges with tasking and empowering. I've only hinted at how you solve one of the problems: who should be on the committees, not what their job should be and what authority they should have. That's going to have to be negotiated with AI researchers who are going to maybe not like this. Probably not going to like this. If they listen to the people who have to deal with IACUCs and IRBs, they're definitely not going to like it. And then then we have this other problem that we have to secure individual buy-in, not just from researchers that are doing the work, but from people that are willing to. That's a lot of work to review these protocols, but also from institutions and corporates. You got to get them to buy in, see that this is important, or else coerce them in some way. So those are remaining challenges. Thank you very much. Take this out, hand it back and forth. You're gonna sit.
Okay, yeah, I'll go. I was wondering how we figure out what systems fall under the scope of these committees. I mean, the committees themselves, in human and animal cases, have some subtle decisions to make, but we have pretty straightforward rules for figuring out which systems fall under the scope. I mean, in one case, humans. In the other case, you said, okay, vertebrate animals. Okay, it's a bit arbitrary, but at least it's a line. It's very hard to see what a comparable line or criterion is going to be for what systems fall under the scope of an AI research subjects committee. Is it every AI system? I mean, there is this, I don't know if you've seen the website out there, People for the Ethical Treatment of Reinforcement Learners. Every time you give that negative reward signal, there could be a bit of suffering going on, and some ethicists have to be looking into this. And even if you're skeptical about this, it's very unclear there's going to be any bright line anywhere to be drawn. So do you have ideas about how to?
I thought about this a little bit. So a couple things to say. First, on the IACUC boxes, there's the first box on a protocol says, does this experiment cause more than momentary pain or distress to the research subject? If the box says no, then someone from the IACUC can just be assigned to look at the protocol and pass it off without it going through a whole committee. So you could have something like that. It's still not going to do the narrowing you need, because you're thinking there's going to be tons of these research programs which are AI research programs. So what do you do about that? I think the answer is, well, I'm willing to say this. I'm happy to leave it up to the AI researchers, because they're the ones that oftentimes in their funding make these promises about how robust their machine learning capabilities are going to be. And so I'm okay with, hey, if we fund it and it's part of the research thing that they think that it's going to realize robust cognitive capacities, then we should evaluate that. But if they admit in their thing, like, we're just doing reinforcement learning, we're not doing anything different, we're using traditional computational components, then it doesn't go through review. So. Well, I think we make a judgment. We come up with a version of the checkbox, and it's if you're doing research where maybe what we sit around and we fight about and we say, look, no silicon-based computation system of this type is ever going to be conscious. I don't know if that's true, but maybe we say that. So if is this just silicon-based machine learning? That gets checkbox, doesn't go to the committee, done. But yeah, we're gonna have to sit and fight about what exactly falls in the boundary of what these committees look at in full. Yeah.
Can I just add to that this isn't a special problem that would be to this kind of case. This comes up in IRB and human subjects research as well, right? There's the question of when you're interacting with human subjects, in what ways or what other ways, when does it trigger in? And we do give some discretion to the the researchers or the people doing it. But on the other hand, if it's a border case or it might be an over case and you don't do it, then there's a cost on the other end. So that's an incentive for the researchers to be honest about when it's appropriate and when it's not.
So I was curious, how has buy-in, how has the buy-in process been enacted for previous research oversight initiatives like IACUC, and how should and shouldn't that inform this?
That's a really, really good question. So the buy-in process for IRBs and IACUCs has been mandated by law, which is nice because you get buy-in just by coercion. But that is not true for escrow committees. So escrow committees are a really interesting case. So escrow committees came about at sort of the foundation of embryonic stem cell research oversight, which was during the second Bush presidency. And so there were going to be no government regulations of this. The only government regulation was going to be, we're not going to federally fund any research on this. Insert a joke here about how the good old days were when Bush was the conservative. And don't sue me if you're watching the live stream. So industry just got together. They said, hey, the public is concerned about embryonic stem cell research. We want to do this research in ways that's going to be acceptable to them as much as we can, but we want to reap the benefits. So industry and academia actually got together, collaborated, and set these standards and just opted to buy in. So I haven't studied that process enough to know like what kind of incentives there were, but there was massive buy-in because researchers really wanted to use stem cell lines that weren't approved by the government. So they were willing to get rid of the government funding to do this research. But they were sensitive to the ethical concerns. I don't know if AI researchers, I'm sure I'll hear about it, are as amenable to that, but the escrow case is a nice case of that.
Okay. So one of the bedrocks of human subjects research is informed consent. So I was wondering, why you sort of didn't maybe touch on the idea of if we did actually end up having AI that's sufficiently similar to us, they might have moral status, and then we might have to ask them for voluntary consent to participate in research.
You let me know if you want to jump in, but I think that's right. So the ethical aim is treat subjects commensurate with their moral status. And so if the capacities end up being the ones that are just like ours, and we think we deserve informed consent as a constraint, then they're going to get that too. And so that raises a problem that you might think that it's a bad idea to spend money on research where you might generate research subjects who won't approve, and then you can't do the research anymore, which is a serious worry. Yeah.
But it also speaks to the design and constraint issue that Eric and Mara were talking about, that if it is possible that you're going to create this kind of entity, you might also have to ensure that it's designed in a way that at that point it could give consent, or it could be possible for it to understand enough to give consent. Right, then that's another question at that point, right? Then you'd have to release it, whatever that means, from the research, and that's to the question of does that mean you should not start down this research path in the first place or something? Yeah.
I have a question about a certain PR issue that could arise. So what we have frequently seen, including AI research, is that good arguments get devolved into bad arguments. It's a certain instance of Gresham's law that seems to be going on. Now, when applied to co-opting and coercing industry into doing AI research, how does one ensure that the argument, that the justification industry uses actually corresponds with being on track to creating a safe AI rather than some similar incentive which will, in the limit, still divert into horrible consequences?
I got something. But you can go.
Well, I mean, so I'll just say this. We refer to coercion a couple times by the power of the state is essentially what we were talking about. But there's other types of incentives. The embryonic stem cell case was an example of a positive incentive. And so if you're talking about industry, there might be positive incentives. I mean, there already are. Industry is interested in doing this in a way that's not going to cause problems with, autonomous vehicles, so they're going to try to be proactive about that, right? So trying to head off these kinds of potential public relations problem could be a positive incentive for instituting some kind of institutional oversight to prevent it from happening in the first place.
When we get to human level AI, then probably they will also want to be AI researchers and do the research themselves. Should we put them as well as part of the committees?
That's the question that comes up. Ron gets excited about this question. I don't know. One of the things I like about this, so like this relates to the question about informed consent. We have these existing models of what the right way to treat human subjects are, but those are actual compromises on the basis of, hey, we're going to do human subject research. Let's sit around and form some policy about what's appropriate. And so this actually gives us a chance to sort of think about in a new way what commensurate treatment equals and how informed consent plays a role against other judgments. And I think that whether we should allow AI on and what role their consent is going to play is going to be a function of those discussions. So I don't want to prejudge it, but I don't see any problem with it. So the last time we gave this talk, someone suggested that Watson, there's already a version of Watson that's like a research-intensive version of Watson. You put it on research committees to help you solve certain problems, and they asked about putting that. And I don't have any in-principle objection to it, for sure.
I appreciate that you've fleshed out this idea that's been around for a while about whether or not there will ever be AI IRBs. There's a few questions that come to mind. One is, first of all, you've talked as if they're two different models, a compliance and an IRB model, but actually those are the same model in the way that they are instituted in the United States. The compliance officers prepare the people for the IRB and prepare the IRB for what the issues will be that they will have to make a decision on. But I think the more important question was alluded to by Dave earlier, and that's really, when does this kind of process kick in? Yours has presumed that we have a very advanced AI, and therefore we get into these questions about informed consent or what its level of cognitive capabilities are, and therefore whether it would be an appropriate subject, and therefore, or what level of rights it would have. But there's a prior question to that about when do we start getting to an area where we should even be concerned about that? So if we're going to hook up biological material to an AI, for example, in order to check out questions of emotions and pain, regardless of its cognitive status, if it can give pain responses, should we consider that something unethical to do a priori? Or might that be, as with animal pain, appropriate under certain circumstances? And then the other thing you alluded to a little bit earlier was, what about cognitive pain?
Just on the compliance question, that's right. I mean, there's a compliance component to the committee setup. What we had in mind is a strictly compliance model that are sometimes used in certain types of research labs with hazardous materials or other things, where you don't have to go in front of a committee. You just check a list, and then we inspect the lab to make sure the things are set. So that was what that distinction was about.
Yeah, and on the other point, I'm not exactly sure how to answer the pain question, but like, when do we start evaluating this? If we're really so confident that current AI research and machine learning techniques are not going to raise any of these problems, then the cost to having that sent to a committee that just says, here's why we don't think we should be subject to evaluation. You read their reasons and say, okay, and then it's over. There doesn't seem to be that much of a cost to starting early. Especially, I mean, the thing is, whenever I go to give this talk or talk about this stuff, I do feel the silliness of it. But at the same time, like Nick said yesterday, this stuff is going to seem silly, but then all of a sudden it's going to become controversial. And so I have that worry. And so if you trust what people that know about AI say, it just doesn't seem like it's that problematic or that sort of silly to say, hey, let's start thinking about this about current AI. Just have a researcher tell me why it doesn't matter that much or why I'm not likely to have ethical worries about this. I check a box and we're done. So the cost seems minimal to me to doing it broadly. Yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah. Well, okay. If we can share one. Sure. Yeah. Actually, let me start by asking the panelists a question. Eric, is this working? Yeah. Eric raised the issue in their talk about whether some issues that might come up might be actually underdetermined by the ethical intuitions we have. I mean, our ethical intuitions are based on cases involving, relatively familiar considerations, but we might be confronted with cases where the ethical intuitions that are the basis for ethical theories just run out and they don't have anything to say, but it seems like we've got to make some kind of decision. Anybody want to speak to that?
I think that's true, and it raises problems about what to do in those cases, but I don't think that's a special problem in ethics. Me and Eric were talking yesterday about epistemic normativity and our epistemic norms, and they're going to have similar problems. So I'd like to hear more about why that raises challenges. It seems the moral status case is actually not that hard. There's problems with determining when we're going to detect capacities and which capacities. We can fight about which capacities give rise to moral status, but there's actually not that much intuitioning going on. I think everyone up here would agree that the capacity for suffering is a morally relevant capacity. Either it's relevant because we desire not to, or just at its base. And so we all agree on that. And so once you have that, if everybody agrees to that, that tells you a lot about one thing to protect AI from. So are there other capacities that we haven't imagined that we should be sensitive to? Maybe, but you can get a lot of ground with the agreement I think we all have.
I actually have a slightly different view, which is that I think that as technologies get better, these vagueness problems are gonna arise, and they're gonna be hard. So let me just give a few examples. So now people are putting embryonic stem cells into mice and maybe sometimes chimpanzees, and there are real issues about whether they're acquiring human-like levels capacity. So these mice can do way better. You can see their dendrites sort of totally growing, much denser than compared to normals. And so I think that's going to raise issues, it's going to raise issues about what's it like to be X, where we just have no idea. So we got these ordinary cases, but then there are these and then the other thing is with CRISPR and genetic engineering, there are issues about chimeras. Human-animal chimeras, other animal chimeras, and they're all, I think that's a really good question. And I don't know if I think they need we need to think more carefully about these issues. So.
Any of the panelists have any questions for each other?
I had a question on the last talk. So I was wondering why, one of the things about the committee that you were, the committee as you were talking about, it was entirely focused on risks to the AI participants, right? But you could imagine a similar committee which would also be tasked with looking at risks to humans and society and those sorts of things, the kinds of things that have been emphasized by Bostrom and Yudkowsky and those, that people. And so I was wondering, and it seems like it would draw upon a similar range of expertise, and also that you might get more buy-in because people might not care much about the status of AIs, but they sure care a lot about the future of humanity. So I was wondering why you weren't thinking about the committee in terms of taking on both of those tasks.
Yeah, I think that there's things that are exactly analogous, right? So you propose certain design principles that you put into the artificial intelligence to make sure that its moral status is recognized. This is to head off a certain set of problems. And this morning we heard a lot about trying to figure out how to build in other kinds of architectures into the AI to build up to foreclose all kinds of other types of threats to human beings, right? And in both cases you have an issue of how do you ensure that these things are actually done. And so you'd have an oversight model, so some kind of oversight model, and maybe a committee-based model would be appropriate for that. So this wasn't meant in any way as being exclusionary of that. We do have to think a little bit about whether the same type of committee model is appropriate. We talked a little bit actually about this over lunch, and so we're not 100% sure about that, but it could probably be extended in that way.
Okay, questions. Let's see. Let's see right here. Can people shut off the screen? There's no reason for them to have that in their eyes.
Thank you, Ned.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Mr. Liao, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Your theory of the moral worth of a human being by its genetic constitution, would entitle frozen embryos to be protected until they could be implanted in somebody willing. And also that if in the future it becomes possible to transfer a fetus into an artificial womb, that pregnant women would be obliged, if they want to terminate their pregnancy, to have the child safely transferred. Now, I actually agree with this implication. I would go farther than that, but just based on your principle, this is what it entails. What do you think?
I think it does entail that. So I think that one of the things I've actually argued in print is that when we do IVF, right now we're creating too many excess embryos anyways, and so it's a reason for just sort of producing enough the embryos that you're actually going to implant. So it could be sort of as it were a technical problem in the future. So.
Okay. So all of you, to some degree or another, touched on the idea of a human-grade artificial intelligence system. And to give some context to this question, I'd like to give two short scenarios. The first being a family decides to have a child, resulting in a family, which is obviously fine. But then you imagine a company who decides to produce a bunch of babies for a developmental study. And so my question is, a lot of you talked about like doing research to explore human-grade artificial intelligence systems, but what kind of ethical implications surround the creation of these systems? This deals a lot with the last talk we had, but I'd like to hear your thoughts from all of you.
Well, my inclination would be to think that we want to be very careful about having companies create beings with human-grade moral status. There's definitely a risk that would create conditions of slavery for the artificial beings if they really do deserve moral status. It might also create the artificial appearance of non-slavery if they're created with self-destructive desires or desires to do the bidding of the company in a way that violates the self-respect design principle. So, so I think Mara and I would suggest that we should be very cautious about allowing that.
So, an issue that's been kind of in the background for a lot of the discussion during this session is that of consciousness, but it's been something that's been kind of blocked because it's tricky. It's really tricky to say what consciousness is or how to detect it. But I guess I want to ask a background question to that: is do you, for any of you, do you think that the capacity for consciousness is a necessary condition for moral status? And to maybe make that more concrete, suppose we have a very, very sophisticated AI, very behaviorally complex, can do lots of apparently goal-directed things, but we're convinced on independent grounds it does not have phenomenal consciousness. There's nothing it's like to be this AI. Does that mean that this thing is disqualified from having moral status? And if so, what is it about consciousness that gives moral status?
Well, I mean, it might be valuable as a very sophisticated artifact without consciousness, but presumably you're caring about that thing in particular. And when you're giving something moral consideration, you're giving it like consideration from its point of view, or like you're considering its ends. And it doesn't make sense to do that if it doesn't have a point of view. So I guess that's kind of where I see consciousness being important, although like difficult to pin down or being its own issue.
So I don't think you need to have consciousness in order to have moral status. So if you look at the slide that I have, look at plants. Plants, unless you're a panpsychist, you think they don't have consciousness, but they have moral standing. So we shouldn't just go around chopping off plants. So you might think there already are entities that have moral status without consciousness. So the rationality might give you something else. So if you're zombies, it might give you a different kind of moral status. But I don't see why, in principle, you couldn't have moral status just because you don't have consciousness. Paul disagrees.
I want to say something real quick. So sort of also deeper in the background in these, all of us, when we talk about moral status, I think really mean a specific kind of moral status, not just something that means you're an object of concern, but your welfare is subject to our concern. And so the disagreement you're getting here is a disagreement over the nature of welfare. So if you're any kind of mentalist or subjectivist about welfare, you're going to think it's a necessary condition for moral status under this framework. And if you're not, like it sounds like Matt is not, if you're an objective lister that has natural functioning or teleological counts, then it's not going to be necessary.
That's right. I'm trying to sort of visualize how this institutional review board model would work. And I have some difficulty just thinking about the way that AI research is structured and the tempo of research. So with invertebrate research, typically you would plan your experiment many months in advance, and you do a few experiments per year, perhaps. But with an AI lab, maybe you run 10,000 experiments in an afternoon with slight permutations, and then midway through you see it doesn't work, so you think, what would happen if we fiddled with this thing? It's just harder to see how that, in a practical way, could work if you had to apply for pre-approval by some committee. Also, most medical research is sort of done in an institutional setting in academia or by industry, whereas a lot of AI research still today, you can do it as an individual, you really don't need this, it doesn't have the same resource requirements. So would this only apply to the research done by institutions, or would it apply to anybody who just wants to play around with TensorFlow and implement some new idea they have?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Can I answer the second one first? Say something like maybe the industries have to get approval, but then you could sign an agreement to do experiments using their code or their implementations or something, and they're approved via approval of the institution. So maybe you could work around it that way. I hadn't thought much about that challenge, but it is a serious problem that you can do these things sort of in your backyard, so to speak. That's true of human subjects research, I guess. But also this thing about the numbers of experiments. I think before IRBs, if you had told researchers that that you were going to do this, they would say, well, that's not how research works. We start a thing and then we might start another experiment in parallel once we see some results and things like that. And we just don't allow that anymore, right? You have to get protocols. So you could imagine protocols that give them a lot of flexibility with what they're allowed to do and how many things they're allowed to run in a given protocol, but they don't get total flexibility. So you might not limit the total number of experiments. They can tell you in advance, these are the different number of ways we want to try to instantiate learning, and we don't see a problem on any of them. Can we get approval for this wide range? And then you let them run within that range. First pass.
Two important precursors to the no difference argument. The first is Andy Clark and Dave Chalmers' parity principle for extended mind. When an object counts as part of my extended mind, it has to meet parity, which means there has to be no difference between its processing and mine. The more important precursor is Turing's test, which hasn't come up in this conference yet, which is kind of interesting. So Turing's test is over 60 years old, and it hasn't been convincing. So I wonder why the no difference argument is going to be more convincing than the Turing test, which is basically a no difference argument.
Right, yeah, so the Turing test is a no difference argument, but it's one that relies on a limited range of types of evidence, right? So there's no observable difference in verbal exchange as judged by a human judge of a certain sort, right? So so that's a very limited range of evidence, and I would hope that a fuller examination would draw on a diversity of evidence and not just that. So I do think that's an important precursor that's similar in spirit, but I guess I just wouldn't limit it in quite that way.
I'd like to ask a question that perhaps extends the idea of moral standing to moral importance. In us humans, when we suffer the loss of someone with whom we have an important relationship, we suffer. So let's say somebody kills our spouse, or kills the leader of an important movement. There may be one or many people who suffer greatly, psychic pain and emotional suffering from that loss. My question is, if we have a virtual or artificial intelligence entity, say without consciousness, without any physicality, without sentience, desire, without any capability of moral agency, might the elimination of that entity be of such moral importance that it might be equivalent to the loss of someone who has moral standing or even of greater moral importance?
I wouldn't have thought so. I mean, once you don't have sentience and all the things, you kind of ruled out everything. It looks like it's my phone. I mean, I feel bad when my phone, drop it in the water, and I'm sort of mourning for a couple days because I lost all the photos. But, I mean, that would be that level, right? So it's when the interesting issue is when you add in all those different things, then whether we should be mourning an artificial moral intelligence the way we would mourn a person. And that, what you're raising is something, so one of the things I mentioned is intrinsic properties. That gives something the moral standing. But then in addition, you might have extrinsic properties. You might have certain relations. So once you have a companion AI, you come to develop certain relationship with the AI, then you might feel attached, and in which case you would have these additional considerations towards this entity. Mara, you want to?
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, when you design an artifact, you could have ethics around its design because maybe it's a weapon and it's going to harm people and it shouldn't be built or something like that. But the point with AI would be that you're also taking into consideration in the ethics of the design, consideration for the thing itself, not for what impact it'll have. So something like that, I don't think would have that kind of consideration.
I'm thinking about these, the AI subject committees. I was thinking about what kind of treatment of the AIs is the relevant kind here. I mean, you talked at one point as if it was mostly pain and suffering, but I think there's all kinds of things we might do to systems beyond pain and suffering that seem very morally relevant. And, thinking about, for example, what goes on in a machine learning system, with big data and, long-term supervised learning over time, trial after trial for up to millions of trials. That's the kind of thing we might call cruel and unusual punishment if say a human child was subjected to this. So is there going to be a moral issue there? Not to mention the possibilities for brainwashing as you take a AI system and retrain it on a whole bunch of new data into different directions. At what point do these issues arise?
Good question. So I didn't mean to, when I say suffering, I want to understand that broadly, including things like frustration and feelings of stress and other things like that. So I have this little paper where I just argue that at least it seems like a capacity for enjoyment and suffering might be necessary, even though it's not maybe not sufficient for moral status, but it's necessary. There's nothing wrong with let's say there's a computer that can have experiences of color, and that's the only phenomenal states it can have. It seems to me morally unproblematic to make it see green forever rather than red forever, or alternate the colors. Maybe that's not true. I try to argue for that. So there's got to be certain sort of attitudinal responses, or it's got to have desires or something like that in order for it to be problematic. So the machine learning case, it's only going to be bad for it to be subject to these infinite tests if it cares about being subject to infinite tests.
The last question.
Thank you. I just want to... Thank you, Ned. Let me take this opportunity now. I do want to comment on the disagreement that was implicit between what Mara was saying, what Matthew was saying. Look, it does seem to me that the distinction, which I think Peter Railton alluded to a few questions back, between having value and having moral status is very, very important in this connection. So there are many things that have value and which it would therefore be wrong to destroy without those being things that you are actually wronging. So plants, I think, are probably... A painting is like, beautiful painting by Titian is like that. It would be wrong to destroy it, but not because it would suffer, but just because it's a valuable thing that it would be wrong to destroy. And I think for these purposes, nothing could be more important than that distinction. Now, whether being the kind of thing that can be wronged, it requires consciousness, or how that's exactly to be understood, whether that's suffering. I'm inclined to think that it is really a phenomenal notion, and not just that of having a point of view. You could think of that, a machine, as having a point of view in the sense of a representation of its place in space and time and so forth, without undergoing the kinds of states that arouse moral concern, namely pain and suffering.
Yeah, great. So, so thanks. So I think I agree with that. I think that there's a distinction between being interested in something and having an interest in, just having an interest in something. So being interested in something requires that you desire, you have consciousness, et cetera, But then there's the other thing, which is just having an interest. And some people, this is up for debate. Some people think that plants can have the latter kinds of interests, and that is sufficient for it to have moral status. Whereas, you might think, I mean, it's an open question whether artworks can have that. I'm inclined to think artworks is more like have extrinsic properties rather than intrinsic properties. But certainly plants, you might think in virtue of their complexity, they have some sort of intrinsic property, and it's in their interest. It's in their interest to be watered, to get sunlight, et cetera, whether they can desire or not. But I understand the problem. So.
Let's thank our panel.